Hello and welcome to the Tangle of the Day. My name is Amy Lilien-Harper and I am one of the children's librarians at the Wilton Library, and I am also a certified Zentangle instructor, and I am going to be teaching you a tangle today. So before we get started, I just want to show you my supplies. But before we even do that, the Zentangle process has a series of steps, and the first step is gratitude and appreciation. And I always encourage my students to take a few deep breaths, try to check in with their bodies, relax themselves, and get themselves in a good mindset to really delve into their Zentangle process. So I encourage you to pause your video and go ahead and do that, and then we'll get started. So I'm working on what is called a bijou tile. This is a standard size tile. The bijou, as you can see, is a quarter the size of the standard size tile. The standards are about 3.5 by 3.5. And I work on these very small tiles so that we can complete one tangle, a monotangle, in a short period of time so the videos don't get too long. So before we start, I'm just going to go over my supplies really quickly. So I am going to be working with this pen. It's called a Micron 01. You can see it has a very sharp point. This allows us to keep our lines very narrow. It's also got really nice ink. I also sometimes use this pen. It's called a Micron PN. You can see this one has a hard point, which is nice for people who like a little bit of more strength on their points. But any pen that you have, as long as it's a real ink pen and not a ballpoint, should work fine. I also have this nifty little Zentangle pencil, and you can see it's very small. It fits right into the palm of my hand. But any soft lead pencil, like a number 2 pencil, will work. And then I have this little thing. It's called a tortillon. It's a blending tool. If you've done art before, you probably recognize it. And if you have one, that's great. If you do not, you can use a Q-tip or even the tip of your finger. Whatever you've got around should work. So let's get started. Now, the first step after gratitude and appreciation in the Zentangle process is our corner dots. So we're going to create our corner dots. Now, when I work on a full-size tile, I usually try to move in a little further from the corners than I am here, but I'm trying to maximize my space because these tiles are so tiny. And everything we do in pencil, we're going to do very lightly because it's really just a guide. It is not in any way intended to constrain you, and you can draw right over top of them. That's why we do it in pencil, and we do it very lightly. So I am now going to move on to the next step, which is to create my border. So I'm going to connect the dots until I have a border. Don't worry if your lines aren't perfectly straight. It's not a problem. We are not aspiring towards perfection here. Okay, and then the next step in the process is to create a string, which is a way to break up your space. But because I'm working on such a small tile and I'm doing a monotangle, I am going to skip that step today. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our Nzeppel. Now, you can do Nzeppel as a standard grid tangle, and it works just fine. But I find it to be much more fun, and for people who have trouble with really careful grids, more enjoyable, relaxing, and more interesting looking when you do Crazy Nzeppel. So this is Crazy Nzeppel. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down a series of lines on my paper, and they are just random. Because what I am trying to do here is to divide up my space. And this is why you could do it as a grid, but I'm not going to. And you don't want your spaces to be too tiny, but you do want them to be broken up a bit. And you can see my spaces are all different sizes, they're different shapes, and that's totally fine because we're doing Crazy Nzeppel. If we were doing standard Nzeppel, you would have them all be the same. So I think I'm going to stop. I think that's good. And what I'm going to do now, we describe this as sort of like squishing an egg inside your space. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead actually, and I wouldn't necessarily do this, but I think it will be easier for you to see, to just go back over my border so that we have lines on all sides of each of our spaces. Normally I would do this and just let it run right onto the border, but I'm not going to do that today. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to choose a space and we're going to shove an egg into it. So imagine you had an egg that was just the right size, just a little too big to fit in this space. When you shove it in, it would kind of conform to the space. So what do I mean by that? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually retrace my original line. And when I get to the corner, I'm going to just curve. And then I'm going to curve at the next corner and curve at the next corner and then come together. So you see I just filled that space. And then I'm going to do the same thing. You can see I am retracing my lines. And I'm creating these lovely rounded shapes inside of all of these angular spaces. Now this tangle does take a little bit of practice. You kind of just have to get used to the feel of it in your hand. But it is really fun and it makes a beautiful background. It's a really nice space filler because you can really just stick it in anywhere as long as the space isn't too tiny. So it's a lovely way to just fill sort of a hole on your tile. And you can see that I'm just doing that on each one. So like here's a triangular one. So I'm doing my line, retracing my line, and then I'm just rounding the corner and rounding the corner and rounding the corner. And if you are putting it in a space that happens to have a curved line, which could certainly happen, that's fine too. Just retrace your curve. Whatever your line is like, it works. So it's really a very user-friendly kind of tangle. And it's also kind of a relaxing one because once you join your grid, it's very follow the leader. You just kind of trace your lines and do your little corners. And you just keep doing that until you've filled your whole space, all of your lines, your grid, whatever it is, with these little Nzeppel eggs. I always think it looks kind of like paving stones, like an old-fashioned area where the paving stones were all different sizes because they just sort of took what they could find. And you'll see when we shade, which is going to happen in just a minute because I'm almost done with my line work here, that you can really do some great things with Nzeppel to give you texture and depth. So I'm almost done. I'm just going to do the last couple ones. And hopefully at this point you kind of have the feel for what you're trying to do. And you can see some of my spaces in between are a little bit bigger and some of them are smaller. It just depends on how I happen to draw my sort of egg, and it also depends on what kind of angles you're dealing with when you are creating each sort of paving stone. And I do find that I sometimes have to go back and just look and make sure I didn't miss any. But there we go. So that's done. And that is all of our ink work. So we have completed the tangling part. And now it's time to shade. I love shading this tangle. It's just really fun to shade. Now, as is true of all Zentangle, you can shade in many, many different ways. And there's not really one right way to do it, nor do we worry about the direction of light. So you can kind of do whatever you want. But this is what I like to do. First of all, I like to find all these little intersections where my lines met. And I just put a little bit of graphite in all of those little intersections, just a little bit. And you can see I'm holding my pencil at an angle so that, because I'm really using just the side of my pencil, I'm not using the point so much. And then I'm just going to take my tortillon and I'm going to go back into those spaces and I'm just going to smooth out that graphite. I'm not really spreading it so much. I'm just trying to fill those little spaces so it doesn't look like I scribbled in them. Instead, it just looks like there's a little bit of a shadow in them. It also makes those little lines where they meet kind of fade into the background and allows our Nzeppel itself to kind of come to the front. So I've done that now. And then the other thing that I like to do, and this is really shading the Nzeppel stones themselves, is I like to put like a little sort of little smiley face, a little semicircle on the bottom of each of the stones. And while there's no requirement for us to worry about the direction the light comes from. I do try to be consistent. I just hold my tile in one direction. I happen to hold it this way, but it doesn't really matter. I just try to be consistent so that um, all of my different little semicircles are on the same section of the tile. And then I'm just going to take my tortillon or your finger, whatever you've got, and I'm just going to smooth out that graphite a little bit. And as you can see, as I'm doing this, what it does is it starts to give them almost a little bit of a rounded look. It makes them look a little more three-dimensional. And it's just such an easy thing to do. And it takes such a short time, and it gives you such a nice result. So I really like to do my Nzeppel with this kind of a shade. You can see it's just really quick. I'm just putting a little bit of graphite down on the bottoms, and I'm trying to do a little bit of like a curve even on these ones that are kind of pointed, which makes it a little harder. And even this one, I'll put a little bit. And there you go. There's our Nzeppel. And now to me, this looks like the right direction. At this point, I would normally have you hold your tile at arm's length and look at it and rotate it around, appreciate it, figure out what direction it goes. So I'm going to keep mine this direction because with the shading the way it is, I feel like that should be the bottom. And then you're going to put your chalk, which is your signature, but it's just your two, like your initials or some form of your initials, because it's not supposed to be really obvious. It's just kind of there to sign the front of your work. So I'm going to snug mine in right there. And I'm going to turn this over. I always encourage my students to sign their work and date it so you can remember when you did things. It's so interesting to go back and look at your old stuff. All right, and I am going to write the name of this tangle. It's called Nzeppel, and that's how it is spelled. And then I'm going to go ahead and date my piece as well. And then the last step in the Zentangle process is to appreciate. So I'm going to turn it back over and take a look at it. And you are all done. That's Crazy Nzeppel. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you will visit us again soon.